populations are going ever smaller, this is particularly crucial. But all in all, the biggest reason is that CLIL still remains the easiest and most time-efficient way to increase English exposure at schools. So it just builds its time. It comes down to time. All right, that's all good and everything. And as many of you have shared already, but if you wouldn't mind taking a moment in the chat box and sharing what, if any, experiences you have had teaching in a CLIL setting. So the question is, what, if any, experience have you had teaching in a CLIL setting? So Allison, you taught mostly CLIL last semester. What did you teach? And who did you teach? What grade? And you also did it in Hungary. Cool.
So last semester I was in a middle school and I taught performing arts, home economics, and scouting as CLIL classes. And then when I was in Hungary, I taught math as a CLIL class. Because they
grade?
have high school. 9th grade mostly.
High school, okay. 9th grade, okay. So working with some of the older kiddos. You've had experience with that in the CLIL settings. Anyone else have CLIL teaching experience? Tara, you taught 1st through 6th using art, PE, reading. And sorry, I'm gonna have to change my, let's see. Okay, so Tara, you said that you taught art, PE, reading, and feature class, so farming and hiking. That sounds really interesting. And Emily, you taught textbook and non-textbook, but it wasn't CLIL. So that's an interesting point, is that even if you're, and Denny, you said 6th grade art class. Okay, so even if you're teaching in a straight up English class, what you teach is still content, right? You're teaching, even if it's like teaching fruits and vegetables or about animals, or, you know, all the topics that each unit looks at, that is content. So I do firmly believe that this idea of CLIL, we often think of it as a bigger topic like art or PE or science or math, but content can mean also a topic itself. So these are things I want you to keep in mind, that this is not necessarily something that should be separate from you, even if you are not necessarily in a bilingual school this year. So keep this stuff in mind, okay? All right, we're gonna get back into presentation mode. I wanna thank you guys for sharing your experiences in the chat. Let's see. So the things that we've talked about, a lot of these challenges, and unfortunately this is such a big topic that in the span of 2 hours, we're not going to be able to tackle everything. But I do want to be able to address some of this. And the biggest one is training. Today is a training for us. And even if your co-teachers can't be a part of this conversation today, you can be part of it. And you are part of the conduit that helps to share this information with them. So keep this in mind, that you are an extension and part of the training that some of our local teachers can't necessarily, if they're not able to physically or virtually be here, that you're able to help provide that bridge. So to some degree, we're going to address the lack of curricula. And this is kind of more in an indirect way, just because some of the concepts that I'm going to touch upon today can help you to understand how to build a better, stronger, more effective content or curriculum. But mostly we're going to address the issue of training around it. So the lack of curricula where it's going to be a little more indirect, and the lack of training, a more direct approach, if you will. Okay. And what our sort of like answer to this is SIOP. Have any of you heard of SIOP? Just a show of hands. No. Okay. New acronym for you. Allison, you've heard of it. Did you work within SIOP? No. Okay. All right. So I'm going to be introducing you to SIOP, what it is, what it stands for. And then we're going to look at just a few aspects of it today. And then we're going to be looking at a video with our SIOP kind of caps on and thinking about how we might use some of these principles in our own teaching. Throughout this, I want you to constantly be thinking about how do I apply this to my future teaching context, okay? So first and foremost, what is it? As with a lot of things in the world of TESOL, it is an acronym. It stands for Sheltered Instruction Observational Protocol. And basically, it's an approach that marries language and content. So it's something that can be used in a CLIL setting. It can be used in a straight up ESL class. It can be used in general ed or special ed classes. It was developed by three professors who are well known in the TESOL world, and they came out, I want to say it was back in 2003, with the book Making Content Comprehensible for English Learners. And this has become a series of books, many editions deep. And a lot of what I'm going to share with you today comes from this book, comes from their work on this topic. So what we can say about SIOP, and this is in part what I love about it, is it's really flexible. It really allows for us to apply it in a lot of different kinds of settings. So that's what I mean by the principles that I'm going to share with you. Even if you're not teaching in a CLIL specific, bilingual specific setting, there's a lot here that you can still implement and take, because I would say, in my humble opinion, these are best practices for language teaching in general. What does it entail exactly? So it is composed of 8 components, and within those 8 components are 30 features. A good way to think of it's very logical. The first component being lesson preparation, right? It's where we start. We start with the plan. Also, part of that is building background. So connecting what we're teaching to our students. That's a really important piece. That's what helps with the engagement. How do we teach it? How do we make what we're teaching comprehensible? This is the third part, comprehensible input. What ways can we do that? What are our strategies? This is another component. Building in interaction. So giving our students an opportunity to use language and content that we're giving them. This is really important. And that leads into practice and application. And then how do we do that? That's the lesson delivery. And then thinking about, was this lesson successful? What concepts do we need to review? That goes into review and assessment. So it follows kind of a logical pattern of the instructional cycle in general. It's nothing outworldly there in that. Within these 8 components are a lot of features. And I'm sure as we go through them, you're going to be like, well, I do that already, which is great. And I want you to keep that in mind as we look through these features, things that you know that you've already been doing in your role as a teacher. And also think about what are things that you'd like to try or want to know more about. So let's get into more of the nitty gritty. And I'm going to introduce to you these 30 features rather quickly. We start with any good lesson, we start with our objectives. Within the SIOP model, though, we want to make clear that we have content objectives and we have language objectives. We want to identify what content concepts are appropriate for the age group that we're working with and their language level. So we want to make sure that what we're teaching them is not above, over their heads, or too simple or review something that they already know, because then we lose them, right? That affects student engagement. We want to think about what sort of materials we want to bring into the classroom. A lot of us, our schools are going to be giving us textbooks. We've had that experience. We know that there's kind of a set curriculum, especially in the strictly English only classroom, or English language classroom. But this is still, we can still implement and bring in supplemental materials. We want to find ways to adapt the content in those books, to make those connections with our students. We want to make sure the activities that we bring, and this is something that a lot of us as ETAs and now as ETFs are tasked with, is to come up with these activities that make learning fun and engaging. And you've had experience doing this. We want to make sure that those activities, however, are also hitting and touching upon and meeting our content and language objectives, that they're infused with the content concepts that we've identified. So these 6 particular features are what kind of are composed of that component language prep. And identifying those things, we're planning a lesson. Some additional features we want to consider are linking these concepts to students. And this is where I think a lot of textbooks miss the mark. If we're teaching about, let's say, fruit or animals, that's fine as a topic, but what's missing in a lot of our books is the connection to, like, why am I studying this as a 4th grader? Why is fruit important to me? So this is where we want to build in that bridge and make that link for our students. We can introduce language like, what is your favorite fruit? And this is where we're also start bringing in the supplemental materials and adapting the content. We also want to make sure that we're linking and building upon old concepts to new ones. So we're not just teaching things in isolation and just moving one unit to the next. We want to make sure that there's this buildup, that we're expanding and going deeper. And part of that is being able to identify vocabulary. All of these together are helping us to build background. So we also want to think about how we're delivering this information. I know a lot of us encounter this issue where we're talking to our students and they just don't seem to understand. You know, American English is chocked full, just as I use that term, chocked full of idioms and euphemisms, and we use them all the time. And these aren't things that are necessarily taught in a textbook. So part of our work is to examine what language are we using in our daily conversation and in our instruction with our students. And we want to make sure we adjust that accordingly. We want to make sure we're giving clear explanations. So thinking about how we're giving instructions. We talked a lot about this with classroom management, that sometimes one of the big problems that we face in the classroom in student behavior is because they don't know what to do because of how perhaps we explained it or didn't show how to do something. We want to make sure that we're introducing things using a variety of techniques, that we have multiple entry points. Some students, if we're just introducing a concept, a language concept, let's say, using one activity, this activity maybe it's not resonating with a particular student. So my point here with this is that we want to make sure that we cultivate multiple activities that help us to reach our content and language objectives, but not leaving it all within one singular activity to do that. So these 3 features together compose of our comprehensible input feature or component, let's say. We also want to make sure we're thinking about strategies and using scaffolding, and also critical thinking, getting to those higher order thinking questions and tasks. And all of this is composed of the component strategies. So I'm sure as we're going through this, you're like, yes, we've had workshops on some of these things in isolation or talked about this. All of this falls under the umbrella of SciOp, which is, as you can see, not specific to just content. It's good teaching in general when we're trying to do these things. So some more features to introduce to you: interaction, building opportunities for students to use language and content, super important. And that can also bleed into how we have our students groups and giving them opportunity to work with other students because of how they're paired or how they're seated. We want to make sure also that we're integrating wait time. Very often, and perhaps you've had this experience yourself as language learners, when asked a question, it takes some time to think about how to answer it and how you're going to say it. And if the speaker or the person you're interacting with moves along, we lose confidence. We lose an opportunity to speak. So we want to make sure that we're infusing enough time in between the questions that we ask our students that allows them to think through and process the language that we're giving them and that we're asking of them to use. And we also, and this is the bilingual component here, is any concept, particularly key concept that seems to be unclear, we want to make sure that we're providing opportunities to clarify that in the first language. That's what L1 means. L1 means first language. So if we see that students are not understanding something, we can use that opportunity to ultimately clarify in Mandarin. All of that speaks to the component of interaction. We want to make sure that we make learning kinesthetic. The more senses we engage, the more our students are going to learn and retain their learning. We want to make sure that we're applying content and language together, that the activities that we're having them use, it's not just to introduce language, but it's really to apply it, right? And that application is what's leading towards more critical thinking, more higher order thinking skills. And we want to make sure we're integrating all language and all language skills together. This is what composes of the component practice and application. So when it comes to the actual lesson, we want to make sure within the lesson and delivering it that we're meeting those objectives, the content objectives, the language objectives. We want to make sure students are engaged. If they're not engaged, they're not learning. And we want to make sure that we're pacing the lesson, so we're not going too fast or we're going too slow that we lose students along the way. And lastly, we want to make sure that we pay attention to review and assessment. How do we review key vocabulary, key content concepts? We want to make sure we're giving feedback and not just at the midterm and at the final. So think of the ways that you're letting your students know that you notice their growth and their progress, or if they need help in a certain way, like how they can do that. And that this all feeds into that idea of assessment. And assessment isn't just in a big test. It can be those entry and exit tickets. It can be in those small interactions that you're having with students throughout the lesson. All in all, these 30 features are what compose a PSYOP. So, having spoken a bit about this, I'd like for you in the chat box to comment on what are 2 features of PSYOP you already use in your teaching practice, and what is a PSYOP feature you'd like to learn more about. So let's take a moment and have you address those questions in the chat box. And if you need me to, I can go back to the 2 slides. Or at least I'll go back to the one last slide. So 2 features that you know that you have implemented and used in your teaching this last year, and maybe 1 feature that you'd like to learn more about or try to use more of. So Allison said she used wait time and kinesthetic learning, and she wants to be better at and learn more about regular feedback. Great. And Liquan, you use student engagement, reviewing key vocabulary, and want to do more around pacing. Connor, you wrote, I think I already very loosely follow the SIOP model without even knowing. Right. You've worked with group configurations and interaction a lot and want to get better at pacing. I think pacing was a big one that seemed to come up a lot last year. Jason, you said that you've utilized comprehensible input, integrating all language skills, and also want to address pacing more. Pacing is coming up a lot, I see. Yeah. And pacing is really a matter of practice. This comes with time and practice. Denny says using speech appropriate for levels, speaking faster, slower. So those are things that you definitely used a lot last year, but want to work on linking concepts to students and building off of old concepts to transition from lesson to lesson. Great. And Tara, also kinesthetic and reviewing. Want to do more of assessing. Okay. All right. This is all really helpful, guys. This helps me to know how to also direct more future workshops. So I really appreciate the feedback, even if I'm not talking about it all this very moment, addressing what each of you share. Yeah, assessment is a big topic, and that's something too that as we get more into this world of teaching, is something to dive a little bit deeper into. Okay. This is great. Thank you guys so much for sharing. All right. I'm going to move along and talk a little bit about, now that we've thought about and learned about these SIOP features, what does that look like in a co-teaching context? Because that's the added layer to all of this, right? It's all good and well if I'm teaching by myself, but here I have at least one, if not several, teachers that I'm working with. So if we think about the instructional cycle in general, we've got planning time, teaching time, assessing, and reflection, ideally. Certainly, I'm sure for those of you that were teaching last semester, you were in the thick of co-planning and co-teaching, especially the co-teaching, and maybe had less opportunity around co-assessing and reflecting. But in an ideal co-teaching situation, you'd have these 4 components. And where we see a lot happening with SIOP is in the co-planning and the co-teaching stages. So it makes sense around planning that we're looking at lesson preparation, we're building background, we're thinking about how are we connecting what we want to teach to our students? How are we sharing this in a way that they're going to understand it? What kind of strategies do we want to use? What kind of interactions and activities do we want to implement? That's a lot of our planning. And then that bleeds over into the actual teaching. So we plan it and then we do it. So in co-teaching, it makes sense that we find lesson delivery and the actual practice and application. And this is actually where I want to focus a little bit further in today's workshop, is to dig a little bit deeper around lesson delivery and practice and application. Why? Because these things start with lesson preparation, right? Whenever we are getting ready to go to teach a lesson, we are tackling several questions. And ideally, we're doing this with our co-teacher. We're thinking about what are our objectives? What do we want our students to be able to do by the end of the lesson? And remember, with the SIOP model, we're not just thinking about this in terms of language, but also with content. So if you're teaching from a book standpoint, you can integrate the content of the unit, which might be a grammar. I mean, it can bleed over into the language a little bit, but it could also be something that stands alone on its own. So those are things to think about. You also, when co-teaching, you need to determine who is coming up with these objectives. Are you both doing it? Are you splitting it? Is one of you working more focused on the content objective, especially if you're working with a local content teacher, and one of you is more focused on language objectives, or are you doing this in tandem together? But I think it's important to have these conversations, as well as how will you reach these objectives? And this is where your lesson starts to build itself. I really like this graph because I think it really shows how, in planning for these objectives and thinking about the content, you start thinking about, okay, what materials do I need to bring in? How do I need to adapt this? What might be some really effective activities I bring into this? And then we start to see this materialize itself in the actual delivery of the lesson. By, are we meeting those objectives? And are our students engaged? And like, how do we pace? How do we address all these things within the span of one lesson or over many lessons? So we have to address that issue of pacing. And this is something I know a lot of you address, that's an area that you want to get better at. And I will say that's good that you've identified that, because that means that that's something that you can work towards. It's also something that just takes time and practice. So it gets better, trust me. We're going to have a little bit of a closer look at the component of practice and application. And I want to go a little bit deeper in looking at the feature of kinesthetic learning. So hands-on materials and manipulatives that are provided to help practice using new content knowledge in the classroom. So we can think of this as, how do we help facilitate guided practice through kinesthetic learning? And there are 4 questions that I think are really helpful for us to think about. How much material should be practiced in one time? How long in time should a practice period be? How often should students practice? And how will students know how well they've done? A lot of this addresses those concerns that you have about pacing, as well as assessment. So in answering these questions, I hope it helps you to start thinking about how you can address and be more effective in your pacing of your lesson. So let's tackle the first question. How much material should be practiced at one time? What do you think? A lot or a little? Show me with your hands. A lot or a little? Yeah, a little bit, okay? But we want it to be meaningful. This is the important part. Short and meaningful amounts of time. So we don't want to waste a lot of time. This is why having classroom routines is really important, because when we get in routines, we can sync up the lesson, we can tighten it up. But when we are introducing material, we don't want to spend too much time on it that it's overwhelming for our students. We want to keep it short, and we want to keep it to the point, and we want it to be meaningful. How about how long in time should a practice period be? Again, a short amount of time so that students can exert intense effort, and it builds that intent to learn. If we give them a lot of time to like ease into the lesson, what happens? They waste time. They know how to prolong it, and it doesn't inspire them or motivate them to get to it. So if we're giving them a short amount of time, we want to see them to be very focused and really exert themselves and get to it. We want to light a fire under them, okay? That helps with the motivation and the engagement. How often should students practice? What do you think? Maybe one time or many times? So there's different answers depending on what you're teaching. If it's new learning, we want it to be massed practice. What that means is having several practice periods scheduled close together. So if you're introducing a new concept or new vocabulary, and you want to have short periods of that, but you want to make sure that those periods are introduced more consecutively to one another. Okay. Versus older learning, you can have a more distributed practice, meaning that the spacing periods between when you practice that information that they already know has a bit more time between them. It's not as urgent. This makes sense, right? So we want to make sure we're balancing the old and the new in that regard. And then that last question is, how will students know how well they have done? This is really important. If I'm just in a class and we're just learning stuff and I don't have any sense of how well I'm doing, I start to lose some motivation. I start to disengage. So we want to find ways to let our students know. And that means giving them specific feedback. Letting them know, specifically what they've learned. I see a lot of teachers, things are like a checklist. Do the workbook, teacher checks it off. They'll assess, okay, you did these wrong, redo it. That is a form of feedback, but I want us to find other ways that we can give meaningful feedback. So think about, even in the morning, standing at the doorway, greeting your students, and maybe having them practice a certain greeting. And if they do it, your expression, your reaction is a specific feedback. So think about those small interactions of how you react to the language that your students use is impacting how they feel about their own success. So another feature in practice and application, as we discussed earlier, is the activities that we provide that allow students to apply their content and language knowledge. So remember, this is really important. We learn best by involving ourselves in relevant, meaningful application of what we learn. If we're learning about science words that we never use before, we're probably not going to retain it. So anything that we are introducing to our students, we want as much as possible to make sure that it relates to them, that it's something that's important to them. We have to sometimes build that importance, or we have to find the bridge to it. So some ways that you can do that is, that students can help do this, is to organize new information in graphic organizers. They can use that then to review, and to incorporate solutions, have them generate solutions to real life problems. And that means also allowing them space to discuss and debate things that are current in their lives. That may sound like, I can't imagine my kids speaking a lot. Well, you're helping to provide some of that structured, scaffolded language. We're not talking about, C-SPAN level debates. But where possible, making and allowing them to make comment on what they're learning and the way that it relates to their life. Yet another feature in practice and application are activities that integrate all skill levels. So this came up for a couple of you of, how can I do this better? Something to keep in mind here is reading, writing, listening, and speaking. They're all interrelated and they're all integrated. So we want to make sure that we're not just, kind of teaching them in isolation, which tends to happen with our textbooks, let's be honest. So when we're thinking about supplemental activities, we want to think of supplemental activities that can help to integrate these skills as much as possible. And we can do that through structured interaction with peers, guiding students to use sentence starters or signal words, providing learners with, that should say chance, not change, chance to listen and react to peers' ideas, and even having them write about what they've learned. So finding these little opportunities in which they can utilize and integrate those skills is important. And what we're going to watch later on, I want you to be thinking about, how does this teacher integrate these things? So all of these features, in fact, that we're looking at a little bit more closely, I want you to be examining in the lesson that we'll be observing and watching in a little bit. So in general, some teaching ideas that help to address this particular component of PSYOP are thinking about manipulatives and movement, thinking about hands-on games. So in our last workshop, I provided you all with a list of of games. I know some of them are ones that you've tried. A lot of you had some great ideas and were able to share hands-on games that you found a lot of success with. We can also think about electronic games. So think like, I think about like Advisor Matt. He has this whole cache of PowerPoint games that he's developed. These are really excellent also for helping to practice and apply a lot of the information and review information in the classroom that you've taught them. You can think about foldables. If you're not sure what that is, let me know. I'd be happy to do a workshop on that. That's super fun. And flip charts. Think of readers theater, role plays. These are just a few ideas to help you think about how to integrate these features in your practice. So the next feature that I want to look at is the actual lesson delivery. And once we have looked at both of these two features, then we're going to start our review. We're going to take the opportunity to look at a lesson and assess it for how well it does these things. So I like to think that these objectives, content and language, kind of live together. And in the delivery, we hopefully, because we did our prep work and coming up with our clearly supported or clearly stated content and language objectives, hopefully in the delivery, we're seeing these actually met and supported. Something to keep in mind when you are creating objectives, because sometimes it's not always like clear, like, is this an objective? Am I doing this correctly? Think about, to know that your objective is on the right track, it needs to be observable. It needs to be something that people can see. It needs to be something that's measurable. And it's something that is assessed. So at the end of the lesson, you can know, did I meet my objective or not? If it's too broad, like, you know, if your objective is students will learn English, like, okay, well, how can we measure that? You know, how can we assess that that actually happened? It's a bit too broad. So we want to make sure that it's not so broad that we can't meet it, or that it's ambiguous if we've met it or not. And another feature that we want to look at in lesson delivery is that element of engagement. So we want to really make sure that the majority of the time in the classroom and that time that we have with students, our kids are engaged. I think anything below 90%, then we need to really be thinking about where do I need to tighten up things? Where else within the SIOP model or in my teaching practice do I need to be strengthening my approach in order to make sure that I'm really capturing my students' attention? We can think of student engagement in these three aspects: allocated time, engaged time, and academic learning time. So allocated time is the amount of time that you're giving students to study a topic and a given academic goal. So this all comes also, that ties into pacing. How much time are you allocating for them to work on a certain objective? Engaged time is the time students are actually actively participating in instruction, so maybe doing that actual activity. And then academic learning time is the students' time on task. So it relates to the objective. They all kind of bleed in together. It's not meant to confuse you, but basically thinking about how do I capture and utilize the time I have with my students in a way that I'm not too slow that I lose them, but I'm not too fast that I also leave them behind. So thinking about those things in terms of your pacing. I like this little model here because it helps to kind of show where we can spend maybe the majority of our time. And as you can see, according to this graph, we want to spend a lot of our time in that academic learning time. So we want to maximize our students' time on a task, making sure that they're really achieving those objectives. Okay, yet another feature is that idea of pacing. So you see a lot of these kind of bleed over with each other. And we want to make sure our pacing is appropriate to their ability level. So part of our job in the first days of school is trying to figure out what are our students' levels. How many of our kids are, going to bushibans and cram schools and getting extra English instruction and have a lot more language to work with? How many of our students have special needs and seem to be a bit delayed or behind? You know, really taking time to get to know your kids and what you're working with, especially if you don't have, 500 or 1,000 students you're working with, is time well spent. Obviously, if you are dealing with a bigger number of students, this will be a bit more challenging and will impact how well you're able to adjust to some of these things. So things to think about when we're considering pacing is attention spans. Generally speaking, the younger students are, the smaller their attention span. I think it's fair to say that a first grader, I wouldn't spend more than 5-10 minutes on an activity because that's about the capacity that they have. Older learners, about 20 minutes will suffice. And there's probably some different periods within that. And again, our learners are individuals and have different needs and preferences. So those are things that you'll be gauging, especially in those first weeks of school. You want to also consider how information and content is chunked. So remember, keeping those short, meaningful amounts of time is important. And in doing that, thinking about then what do you include in that short amount of time? If you're teaching a concept, you don't necessarily need to teach the entirety of it, but what parts are you going to focus on? You have to consider your students' proficiency levels, but also think about how, if you have extra time, how can you extend an activity, right? I think we all dealt with this issue is like, oh, class ended, we finished everything early, we have this extra time, oh boy, what do we do? So always planning for how you can extend something or utilize that time. And also just thinking about how you can tighten up things. If you see that a lot of time is being wasted when students first come into class or turning in homework, you only get 40-45 minutes with these kids. So making sure that every moment counts is important, especially if you're only seeing them once or twice a week. So some general ideas for lesson delivery. And some of these I think are concepts that are not new to you, like think, pair, share. So having students think and stew on something, then pair up, and then share out. Chunk and chew, this is structured in time pauses for students to digest new content. So giving them time to process it after you've introduced it. Roman review, this was a new one for me. And this is presented as kind of an end of class activity where students, it's unstructured. Students are given an opportunity to roam around the class and talk with each other about what they've learned in class. I think that might work well with some students, but I wouldn't say that could work with every class. So again, that's something you're going to have to feel out with the students that you're working with. You can also think of utilizing different formats of how you teach, like podcasts, and having kids make short little podcasts about the things, the concepts that they're working on. And that's a great way to integrate a lot of those skills, language skills, or having like a TV talk show, or even having them write headlines. Like you could have a class newspaper that you're putting together, and maybe it consists mostly of headlines. But again, using and building on the language that you're introducing and that they own and that they have already. Not necessarily expecting them to, write a newspaper at the first grade level all in English. That's not what I'm advocating here. So we want to put all of this together, and I'm going to share with you one of my advisees last semester. He was Edgar Grajada. Some of you may know him. He was here in Taipei, working at Minchang Elementary School. And I'm going to share with you a 40-minute lesson that he did teaching first grade life science. And I want you, as you're watching this, to be thinking about the practice and application and the lesson delivery, those particular features. So I'm going to show you a rubric on the next slide. If you have your camera, your phone ready, I would recommend taking a screenshot. I'm going to do the same, and I'm going to line message it to all of you so you have it, so that you can have it with you as you're watching the lesson. And this is the rubric here. So you can see we have the 7 features of practice and application of lesson delivery that we discussed. And as you're watching, I want you to think about how well does he and his co-teacher do these things? Do we see evidence of it? Do we see some evidence, a lot of evidence? And if you see things that are happening in the classroom that you think are things that you want to touch upon or you have questions about, take note of that as well, so that afterwards we can discuss that a little bit more in depth. All right. I'm going to send this to you right now. Okay, you should have it. What I'm gonna share with you also the links, so that in case you have some internet issues, you can still watch these videos. They are posted on a private YouTube channel. So if you want, you're more than welcome to also take a screenshot of this so that you have this. I just want to share with you, as you're doing that, all the materials that so this PowerPoint and that rubric that I just showed you, those have been uploaded to our Google Classroom, so you have that also accessible to you after today's workshop. All right, and with that, are you ready? You ready to watch? Okay. Do a little transition here. Just going to take a moment. Let's see if I can. Sorry guys, it's just taking me a moment to work through the technology here. I'm afraid I can't have the sound on. I haven't quite figured out how to do that without it, like, making our ears bleed. So what I'm going to have you do, this isn't super ideal, but what I'd like for you to do is go to those links. I'm going to go back and share with you the links, and I'm going to have you, actually I'll send them to you in line because that will be easier for you to access, I think. And I would like for you to watch this video, and in about 40 minutes come back and we'll finish up and have our conversation together. I think this might be a little bit easier. I will play it without audio throughout, so at least you can watch it, but it's not going to have as much of an impact unless you're able to actually listen to it as well. So I apologize for that complication, but I don't want to.
Kara, are we going to be watching all three links or just this one link that you're sending us?
All three.
Got it.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. Okay, you should have those links now. So if it's easier for you to just focus on watching that on your own and coming back in 40 minutes, do that. If you don't have that technology, I'm just going to play it and you can at least watch it, although it'll be, I won't have the sound on because I don't want to make your ears bleed. Okay. So, and thanks, Tom, for putting that also in the chat box. So you have it both in the chat box here as well as in our line group. I'll see you in about 40 minutes, guys. Sorry for that.